The sun was not a friend that day. It was a heavy hand pressing down on the back of my neck, relentless and angry. I remember the light was so bright, it turned the world white at the edges of my vision. There was no hiding from it. The earth beneath our feet was hard, baked like clay in a kiln, cracked open in jagged lines that looked like old wounds. When the wind moved, it did not bring cool air. It brought the taste of copper and dry grass. It tasted like old things, like dust that had been sitting undisturbed since the beginning of time. We were out in the open, exposed under that great, burning eye in the sky. The air smelled of heated stone and the sharp, sweet scent of the wild bush that grew thick around us. That smell is etched into me. It is the smell of a place that does not care if men live or die. The school stood there, a small island of brick and noise in a sea of wilderness. The laughter of the young ones was sharp, cutting through the heavy heat. They ran in circles, shouting and chasing, their voices bright and brittle against the vast silence that waited just beyond the fence. They were loud, but their noise felt small, swallowed up by the miles of empty land stretching out in every direction. I watched them run. They were innocent of what walked in the shadows. To them, the sun was just the sun, and the grass was just grass. The routine of the day was a shield. The ringing of the bell, the dust kicking up from their shoes, the simple games. It all felt solid. It felt like the only world that existed. We moved through the motions of the day with our eyes half closed, trusting that the next hour would be exactly like the last. We believed that we were safe here, protected by the boredom of a normal life. But if you looked past the yard, past the running children, the bushland stood still. It was a wall of tangled branches and tall, yellow grass. It did not move. It watched. The wilderness here is not like the tame gardens in the cities. It is deep and old. It felt like a boundary line, a border between the world of men and something else, something wilder. I remember looking at that tree line and feeling a sudden, cold shiver in my gut, despite the heat. It felt as though the trees were holding their breath. We were alone. The stone cities and the paved roads felt like a dream from a different life. Here, under the burning sun, the isolation was absolute. If you shouted, the sound would just drift away and die among the thorns. There was no one coming to check on us. The distance between us and the rest of the world felt stretched, like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap. We were just tiny figures standing on the dry skin of the world, unaware that the sky was about to tear open and show us things that have no names. The silence of the bush was getting louder, pressing in against the laughter, waiting for its turn to speak. The first sign was not a sound, but a wound in the sky. The blue above was perfect, deep and endless, till a sudden flash tore through it. It was distinct, sharp as a razor, blinding and brief. I squinted, shielding my eyes with a dirty hand, thinking it was perhaps the sun glinting off a distant plane. But planes move with a heavy, steady purpose. They drone and drag their tails across the heavens. This thing did not fly. It danced. It was there, and then it was here. A piece of polished silver, bright enough to hurt, hanging over the tree line. Then another joined it, and then a third. 3 shapes smooth as river stones, gleaming with a light that did not seem to come from the sun, but from within the metal itself. They did not have wings. They did not have tails or rivets or smoke. They were simple, terrifyingly perfect circles of light. I watched them move, and my stomach turned over. It was wrong. Things in this world must push against the air to move. They must fight for every inch. These silver discs slipped through the sky without effort. They moved like stones skipped by a giant hand across a pond of still water. They would appear in one spot, hover for a heartbeat, and then blink out of existence, only to reappear a mile away in the blink of an eye. It made me dizzy to follow them. It felt as though my eyes were lying to me, or perhaps the sky itself was broken. The air around us changed. The dry heat of the afternoon was suddenly replaced by a heavy, thick pressure. It felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, when the world holds its breath and the hair on your arms stands up. But there were no clouds. The pressure pushed against my eardrums, a silent weight that made my teeth ache. I could taste metal on my tongue, sour and cold, like licking a battery. The familiar smell of dust and dry grass was gone, replaced by a scent that reminded me of burnt air and lightning. On the ground, the chaos of the playground faltered. The shouting died down, not all at once, but in patches, spreading like a shadow. One by one, the children stopped running. 60 pairs of eyes turned upward. Balls rolled away into the dirt, ignored. Jump ropes fell from slack hands. There was no pointing, no screaming, just a collective, confused stare. We stood frozen, a tableau of statues under the burning sun, watching the impossible dance above the trees. We were small, and the sky had suddenly become very large and very crowded. The fear had not yet fully arrived. There was only a deep, paralyzing confusion, a sense that the rules of the world had been suspended, and we were waiting to see what would fall into the void. Then came the silence. That is the part that wakes me up at night, sweating in the dark. You see, the bush is never truly quiet. Even in the heat of the day, there is always the sound of life. The cicadas scream their high, endless song. The birds call out from the thorns. The wind rustles the dry leaves. The earth is always speaking. But in that moment, the earth choked. It happened in a heartbeat. It was as if a heavy hand had been clamped over the mouth of the world. The insects stopped their screeching instantly. The birds froze on the branches, their beaks shut tight. The wind, which had been pushing the dust around our ankles, simply vanished. It didn't slow down. It just stopped existing. I saw dust motes floating in the air, suspended, refusing to fall to the ground. The stillness was absolute. It pressed against my ears, heavy and hard. It was a silence so deep, it felt like it was shouting at us. And then, underneath the silence, I felt it. I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it in the center of my chest, behind my ribs. It was a low, deep vibration, like the purr of a sleeping lion, but huge. It was a hum that went right through the soles of my shoes and rattled my teeth. It was a sound too low for humans to hear, but the body knew it. My heart started to race, trying to match that impossible rhythm. It felt like the ground itself was trembling with a fever. The air changed again. It stopped being air. It became something else. It thickened. It felt as though we were suddenly standing at the bottom of a deep, warm ocean. Every time I tried to take a breath, it was a struggle, like trying to inhale soup. Moving my arm felt slow, heavy, as if the space between us had turned into clear jelly. The atmosphere was pressing in from all sides, wrapping us in a suffocating blanket. This was not peace. This was not the quiet of a church or a library. This was the quiet of a predator holding its breath before the strike. The hair on my arms stood up, not from cold, but from a primal sickness that rose in my throat. Nature knows when things are wrong. The animals knew. They went mute because they were hiding. They understood that something had entered our world that did not belong. something that broke the rules of the wind and the sky. We stood there, trapped in that amber, listening to the blood rush in our own heads, terrified to make a sound, terrified to break the stillness that had swallowed us whole. One of the silver shapes broke away from the others. It did not fall like a stone dropped from a hand. It lowered itself with a terrifying, controlled slowness. It drifted down behind the rough tangle of scrub and eucalyptus trees at the edge of the school grounds. It moved like a feather caught in a draft. Yet I knew it weighed more than any truck or building. It settled there, hovering just above the ground, refusing to touch the dirt. As I looked at it, my eyes began to water. It was hard to look at, not because it was too bright, but because the air around it was twisting. You know how the road looks on a very hot day? How the heat rises and makes the distance look like it is swimming in water. It was like that, but stronger. The light bent around the craft. It shimmered like a mirage in the desert. The edges of the silver metal were not sharp. They were fuzzy, vibrating against the background of the trees. It looked as if it wasn't fully real, or as if it was burning a hole through the air itself. There was still no sound of engines, no roar of pistons, no smell of diesel fuel. A machine that size should have been shaking the earth, deafening us with its power. But there was only the sound of the air being pushed out of the way, a soft whoosh like a heavy curtain being drawn. It hung there, suspended by nothing, defying the pull of the earth. It mocked the laws of nature just by hanging there. It was a silver scar against the brown and green of the bush. Then the smell hit us. It drifted across the yard on a breeze that shouldn't have been there. It was a sharp, biting scent. It smelled like the air after a lightning strike, that dry, electric smell that coats the back of your throat. But mixed with it was something else. The smell of burning rocks, of minerals being cooked by a fire hot enough to melt stone. It was a smell from the deep earth, or perhaps from no earth at all. It made my nose run and my eyes sting. We should have run away. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was a predator, a fire that would consume us. But we didn't run. We moved closer. It was a pull I cannot explain, like a moth flying into a lantern. The terror was there, cold in my gut, but the curiosity was stronger. It was a glittering trap. We stepped over the invisible line, moving through the tall grass, our shoes crunching softly, drawn toward the shimmering light that hovered just beyond the trees. We walked right into the heat, eyes wide, forgetting everything we knew about safety. While the sky tore open and the air turned to heavy jelly, the world of the adults remained small and sealed shut. The teachers were inside the main building. They had gathered for a meeting, a circle of voices discussing the small, dull things that rule the days of men. They talked of schedules and food, of rules and ink. They sat in the cool shade of the brick walls, blind to the miracle burning the grass just 100 yards away. It is a terrible joke, I think. The most important moment in history was happening right outside their window, and they were looking at papers. We were alone. The realization hit me colder than the fear of the silver ship. In that moment, the bond between parent and child, between teacher and student, snapped. We are taught that if there is danger, you cry out, and the tall ones will come. They will bring stick and stone. They will drive the wolves away. But we cried out, and no one came. Our voices were lost in the heavy silence, or perhaps they reached the building and were dismissed. To the ears inside, our screams were just the noise of play. They heard panic and thought it was a game. They heard terror and thought it was laughter. There was a barrier that day, thicker than the brick walls of the school. It was a wall of belief. The adults lived in a world where silver ships do not land in the bush. They lived in a world where the sun does not flicker and the birds do not go mute. Because they did not believe it could happen, they could not see it. They were safe in their blindness. They drank their tea and nodded their heads while we stood on the edge of the abyss. I remember looking back at the school building. It looked like a painting, flat and far away. It belonged to a different time. I wanted to run to it, to bang on the doors until my fists bled. But I couldn't turn away from the light. And deep down, I knew it would be useless. Even if they came out, would they see? Or would they look at the shimmering air and see only heat? Would they look at the craft and see only a bus or a rock? We were the witnesses. The burden had fallen on us, the small ones, the ones with eyes that had not yet learned to filter out the impossible. We were the only ones awake in a sleeping world. The safety of the school was a lie. There was no shelter. There was only the bush, the silver light, and the silence that had swallowed us. Movement caught my eye. Not from the bush, but from the top of the silver stone itself. Two figures appeared there. They did not climb out of a hatch or open a door. They were simply there, as if the air had curdled into a shape. They were small. That is the first thing I noticed. They were no taller than us, no taller than children. For a second, a foolish hope rose in my chest that they were just boys playing a trick, wearing costumes to scare us. But that hope died the moment they moved. They were dressed in skins of pure black. It was not cloth. It had no seams, no pockets, no wrinkles. It looked tight against their frames, wet and slick like the skin of a frog, or perhaps like polished obsidian. In the bright, punishing glare of the midday sun, they should have been shining. But they were not. Their bodies seemed to drink the light. They were holes in the world, shadows standing up and walking around in the daylight. And the way they moved, it makes me sick to remember it. It was not the movement of a living thing. A man walks, he lifts a foot, places it down, shifts his weight. A lion prowls, smooth, heavy muscle rolling under fur. These things moved like a candle flame flickering in a draft. They were jerky. They were fast, then slow, then fast again. I watched one of them descend from the craft. It did not jump. It did not climb. It drifted. One moment it was on top, the next it was on the ground. There was no space in between. It was like blinking your eyes and finding the world changed. They moved across the rough ground, over the thorns and the anthills. But they did not stumble. They did not look down to see where they were stepping. I looked closely at their feet, if they had feet, and I saw the grass did not bend. They were floating just a hair's breadth above the earth, refusing to touch our soil. They were silhouettes cut from the void. They ran back and forth near the craft, appearing and reappearing. It was hard to count them. Was it 2? Was it 4? They moved too fast to be counted, blurring like a spun coin. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct I had, every drop of blood in my veins that came from my ancestors, screamed one word: demon. These were not of the bush. They were not of the city. They were things that should have stayed in the dark, but they had walked out into the sun. Then they stopped. The flickering movement ceased. The shadows froze in place. Slowly, terrifyingly, they turned to face us. I saw a face, but it was not a face like yours or mine. It was a mask of skin, pale as old paper, stretched tight over a narrow skull. There was no chin, just a sharp angle. There was no nose, just two small slits where breath might enter. It looked unfinished, like a doll made by someone who had forgotten what a human looks like. But I barely noticed the skin. I barely noticed the shape. I saw only the eyes. They were huge. They took up half the face. They were slanted, wrapping around the side of the head like the eyes of a great insect. But an insect's eye is full of life and color. These were empty. They were solid black. There was no white, no pupil, no iris. Just a deep, endless pool of oil. They were like two holes punched into the universe, revealing the absolute dark behind the stars. I looked into them, and I could not look away. It was as if they had hooked invisible wires into my brain. I tried to turn my head, but my neck was stone. I tried to close my eyelids, but they refused to obey. I was locked in that gaze. It was a mirror that reflected nothing back. I saw no recognition in those eyes, no anger, no kindness. I saw only a cold, clinical observation. They were looking at me the way a scientist looks at a bug in a jar. A coldness washed over me, starting at my feet and rising to my chest. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they had turned to lead. The world around me, the trees, the silver ship, the other children, faded into a gray blur. There was only me and those black mirrors. Time stopped. A second stretched out until it felt like an hour. I was floating in that darkness, lost in the void of their stare. They had no mouths. The skin was smooth where lips should be. But as I stared into that blackness, I felt a pressure building inside my head. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence. Someone, something, was knocking on the door of my mind, demanding to be let in. The paralysis was total. I was a prisoner in my own body, held captive by a gaze that was older than the mountains. I wanted to scream, to break the spell, but my throat was tight and dry. I stood there, a statue of flesh, while the black eyes drank me in. The sound broke the silence, but it did not come from the air. It did not come from the wind or the birds. It erupted inside my skull. It was a high, piercing screech, like a radio tuned between stations, screaming directly into the bone behind my ears. I clapped my hands over my head, pressing hard, trying to shut it out. But it was useless. The noise was not outside. It was inside. It was a drill boring into the soft gray matter of my brain. Then, the pictures came. They did not wait for permission. They did not knock. They flooded into my mind like a dam breaking. I saw images flashing faster than a heartbeat. I saw trees falling, hundreds of them, snapping like dry twigs. I saw the earth cracking open, bleeding fire and smoke. I saw the sky turning a bruised, angry purple. These were not my memories. They were not my thoughts. They were being forced into me, shoved into the small space of my mind until I thought I would burst. There were no words. There was no English, no Shona, no language of men. It was pure thought, raw and heavy. It was a communication of feeling, a transfer of terror. I felt the heat of the fires they showed me. I felt the choking smoke in my throat. It was a violation. My mind, which had always been my own private room, was suddenly crowded. A stranger had kicked down the door and was throwing his nightmares onto the floor. It felt like dirty fingers rummaging through my secrets. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. Some of the other children were weeping, tears cutting tracks through the dust on their cheeks. They were clutching their heads, their mouths open in silent screams. Others stood frozen, eyes rolled back, lost in the trance. We were all seeing the same thing, sharing a nightmare that was being beamed into us. The connection was cold and clinical. It did not care if we were afraid. It did not care if we were young. It simply delivered the message, relentless and hard. A sickness rose in my gut, a nausea that had nothing to do with what I had eaten. It was the body rejecting the invasion. My knees shook, threatening to buckle. The pressure in my head grew until my vision blurred. I wanted to vomit, to run, to die, anything to stop the voice. That was not a voice. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, pressing down on the soul. We were not just watching the entities. We were touching them with our minds, and their touch was cold as the void between the stars. The vision shifted. It wasn't just chaos anymore. It became a story, a terrible history of things that had not happened yet. I saw the world I knew, the world of green trees and blue rivers. But it was dying. The pictures were sharp and bright, brighter than reality. I saw the forests stripped away, leaving only bare, red earth that looked like raw meat. I saw the oceans rise up, black and oily, swallowing the land. There were no fish in that water, only death. Then I saw the cause. It wasn't a monster. It was us. I saw the things men build. I saw great towers of metal and glass, taller than mountains, pumping gray smoke into the sky until the sun was choked out. I saw lines of black wire wrapping around the globe like a spider's web, choking the life out of the soil. The voice in my head, the thought that was not mine, felt cold and hard. It showed me machines, flashing lights, and screens. It made me feel that these things were a poison. It showed technology not as a tool, but as a trap, a way for us to forget the earth until it was too late. The air in the vision was thick. I could feel my throat closing up, gasping for breath that wasn't there. I felt the heat of a world set on fire. It was a warning, but it was delivered without mercy. There was no kindness in it. It was a statement of fact. This is what you are doing. This is what will end you. The weight of it was crushing. I was a child. My hands were small. My worries were small. A spelling test, a lost toy, a grazed knee. But in that moment, the entities placed the weight of the entire world on my shoulders. They forced me to look at the end of everything. They took my childhood, which should have been full of play and light, and filled it with the ashes of the future. I felt a desperate, terrifying responsibility. The message was urgent. It screamed at me. You must care for the land. You must stop the destruction. But how? I was just a boy standing in the dust. I wanted to shout back, to tell them I was too small, that I didn't understand. But the images just kept coming, wave after wave of fire and ruin, burning the innocence right out of me. I stood there, trembling, holding the knowledge of the apocalypse in my mind, feeling old, so suddenly and terribly old. The invisible rope that held us tight suddenly snapped. The screaming in my head cut off as if a wire had been severed with a knife. The pressure that had been crushing my chest vanished in an instant, leaving me gasping for air, my lungs hungry and burning. I staggered back, my knees hitting the dirt, the strength draining out of my legs. The paralysis was gone, replaced by a shaking weakness that rattled my bones. I looked up through the tears that blurred my vision. The entities were leaving. They did not wave. They did not look back. They turned their narrow, pale faces away from us, breaking the terrible spell of those black eyes. They moved back toward the silver craft with that same jerky, impossible speed. One moment they were standing on the grass, the next they were near the metal skin of the ship. They did not open a door. They seemed to melt into the silver, absorbed like water into a sponge. The shadows returned to the light. Then the craft moved. It did not roar or shudder. It simply lifted. It rose straight up, silent as smoke, hovering for a heartbeat above the treetops. The shimmering air around it danced violently. Then, with a speed that made my stomach drop, it shot upward. It didn't fly. It vanished. 1 second it was there, a solid silver weight. And the next, it was a speck in the blue. And then, it was nothing. It punched a hole in the sky and was gone. The world crashed back into existence. It was violent. The silence that had covered the bush shattered. The sound of the wind returned with a roar, slapping against my ears. The insects began to scream again, a deafening chorus of chirps and clicks. The birds sang from the branches as if nothing had happened. The dust that had hung suspended in the air fell to the ground. The heavy, thick atmosphere evaporated, leaving the dry, hot air of a normal Tuesday. I stood there, blinking, trying to understand what my eyes had seen. The playground was just a playground again. The trees were just trees. But it felt wrong. The colors looked too bright, too harsh. The noise of the birds felt like a lie. The space where the craft had landed was empty, but the air there still vibrated. It shimmered with a heat that wasn't from the sun. The grass was flattened in a circle, a physical scar on the earth, proving we hadn't dreamed it. The normal world had returned, but it didn't fit anymore. It felt like putting on a coat that was too small. We were left standing in the echo of the event, small and terrified, while the rest of the world kept turning, unaware that the sky had just touched the ground. Then the screaming started. It didn't begin as words. It began as a raw, animal noise. The trance broke, and the terror rushed in to fill the empty space. One child cried out, a high, thin sound that cracked the air. And then we were all screaming. The panic was contagious, jumping from one mind to the next like a spark in dry grass. We turned and ran. We didn't look where we were going. We scrambled over the rough ground, tripping over roots, falling into the dirt, and scrambling back up without feeling the pain of skinned knees. I remember the taste of dust in my mouth and the sound of my own breath tearing at my throat. We ran toward the school building as if the devil himself were snapping at our heels. We ran toward the brick walls, toward the adults, toward anything that felt solid and safe. We crashed into the playground boundaries, a wave of hysterical, weeping children. Faces were streaked with mud and tears. Some were shaking so hard they couldn't stand. Others were babbling, the words tumbling out too fast to be understood. The teachers came out, annoyed at first by the noise. They stepped into the sunlight, squinting, expecting a fight or a game gone wrong. But they stopped when they saw our faces. You cannot fake that kind of fear. It is a look that strips the soul bare. "What is it? What happened?" they asked, their voices rising with worry. But how could we tell them? How do you explain the impossible to people who have forgotten how to see? We grabbed at their clothes, pulling them down to our level. We pointed back at the bush, but the silver shape was gone. "The little men," someone screamed. "The eyes, the big black eyes. They came from the sky." The words sounded mad. Even to my own ears, they sounded like the ravings of a fever. The teachers looked at us, and I saw the wall come down in their eyes. They looked at the empty bush, then back at us. They saw 60 frightened children, but they did not see the cause. They saw the heat. They saw the hysteria. They did not see the truth. "Calm down," they said. It was just a plane. It was just the sun playing tricks. They tried to offer us water. They tried to herd us into the shade. They wanted to fix it with logic, with rational lies that made the world safe again. They patted our heads and told us there were no such things as little men in black skins. They told us, We had imagined it, and that was the moment the true horror set in. It wasn't just that we had seen monsters, it was that we were alone with them. The people who were supposed to protect us, the tall, strong adults, were blind. They stood in the same world as us, but they lived in a different reality. I looked at their faces, calm and confused, and I knew that they would never understand. The gap between us was a canyon. We were on one side, shivering in the shadow of the craft, and they were on the other, safe in their blindness. We had seen the face of the unknown, and they were offering us a cup of tea. Later, when the shouting had stopped and the adults were trying to make sense of the chaos, they gave us paper. They gave us pencils and told us to draw what we had seen. I think they expected the drawings to be different. They thought one child would draw a dog, another a bus, another a cloud. They were looking for the cracks in our story, the proof that we were just silly children making things up in the heat. But the papers told the truth. 60 hands moved across the pages, and 60 pictures came back the same. We drew the silver shapes, flat and round. We drew the trees, and we drew the men. We drew the black skins and the small bodies. But mostly, we drew the eyes. Page after page of those huge, slanted black eyes staring out from the paper. It was a gallery of nightmares. You could see the fear in the jagged lines of the pencil. We did not copy each other. We copied the image that had been branded into our minds. The drawings were not art. They were testimony. The sun eventually went down, but the light did not leave us. That night, and for many nights after, sleep was a battle. I would close my eyes and see that face floating in the darkness. The paralysis would return in my dreams. I would wake up sweating, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for that high-pitched screech to erupt in my skull again. You never truly sleep after you have seen what we saw. You just rest one eye, while the other watches the window, waiting for the silver gleam to return. The darkness of the bedroom felt crowded, as if they were still standing there, watching, studying, the message they pushed into our heads. It didn't fade like a dream does. It grew roots. It went deep into the soil of who we were. I look at the world differently now. When I see smoke rising from a factory or trees being cut down, I feel a physical sickness in my gut. I feel the panic of the end times. They gave us a burden that was too heavy for children to carry. They told us to watch over the earth, but we are small. We are just men. We walk through a world that is busy destroying itself, and we are the only ones who can hear the clock ticking. Men came later, men with soft voices and recording machines, travelers from universities far away. They sat with us in the dust and listened. They did not laugh. They did not scold. They looked at us with sad, serious faces, and I saw that they believed. They knew that the universe is a strange and crowded place. But even they could not take it away. They packed up their tapes and their notebooks and went back to their cities, leaving us alone with the memory. We are older now. The school is just a place of brick and mortar. The grass has grown over the spot where the craft hovered, hiding the scar on the earth. The world has moved on. They call it a story, a legend, a mass delusion born of heat and hysteria. But we know. We are the marked ones. We are bound together by a secret history written in light. When I look up at the blue sky, I do not see an empty heaven anymore. I see a door that was opened once. And I know, with a terrifying certainty, that it can be opened again. I am listening. I am always listening. And I am still waiting for the sound to return.